Continuing on from our last video, we're going to have a look at OSPF authentication, because that's the last parameter that I'm going to cover here that may stop an OSPF adjacency from forming. So let's have a look at a quick animation and then we'll get on to the lab section.
Enabling authentication is an important measure to secure any routing protocol and is simply a method where two neighbors prove their identity to each other by using a shared password. No protocol message is accepted from a neighbor unless the message is correctly authenticated. So for example, if one neighbor is sending an authenticated packet, it won't be accepted by the other neighbor unless the same authentication has been configured, and vice versa. Both routers must agree on the authentication type and authentication key. This allows OSPF to exchange routing update information in a secure manner.
On the Nokia SR7750s, authentication can be configured a few different ways. You could either do it by using the authentication and then the authentication type commands, or you can do it under the system security hierarchy using a keychain and then associating that keychain with OSPF. So when you look at a lot of documentation, they usually say that there's three kinds. There's like no authentication, then there's simple password, there's MD5, but there's actually a fourth method of authentication which is using like SHA, and this is supposed to be more secure than MD5. Let's just have a quick overview of the authentication types. The first one is no authentication, where OSPF by default doesn't have any authentication, so it provides no security for the protocol. Then you have simple authentication, where you're just going to put a password between the OSPF neighbors. You won't be able to actually see the simple password on the actual devices themselves, but when they transmit them to the neighbor, then the password is going to be transmitted in plain text. The third way is MD5 authentication, and this is more secure because it provides the MD5 hash key when it transmits it, and this is the one that's recommended. Because there's been so many attacks on MD5 that have been publicized, then certain organizations asked for a more secure hash algorithm, which is SHA. So let's actually jump onto the routers and go through these configurations, and also as we saw in the diagram, if authentication is not configured on both sides, then you will not form an adjacency. On R1, I'm just going to log in. Make sure that I've still got my log file running, which I have. Then I'm going to verify that the neighbors are up, which they are. So on R2, I will log in there as well. We're going to configure the first, which is the simple authentication. Configure router OSPF area 12 interface. Now the authentication type will be password, and the authentication key, which is basically the authentication string, the authentication password itself, I'm going to call this one let me in. As soon as I enter this, when I jump over to R1, we should see that the neighborship has gone down, which it hasn't. It's timing out, it's timing out, and now it's gone down. And when we look into the logs, this is all just the system coming up. Alright, this is the first part that we see. We can see here that there's an authentication type mismatch. And this is because one side is configured for authentication and the other side isn't. We're just going to make those match up. Let me in. And we can see here that it's gone back to the full state. We could also verify this with the show router OSPF neighbor, and they're in full. The next one that I'm going to show is the MD5. So jump back over to R2. Have to shut down the interface and say no authentication type. Also no authentication key. Just copy it from here. Bring the interface back up. Authentication type. And this time we're going to do message digest. The format's slightly different. Now we type the message digest key. I'm just going to say key 1, MD5, and then I'm going to put a password of router coach. Again, when we jump over to R1 and look at the logs, we should see that it's disrupted the neighborship. So that's already gone down. Let's have a look at the file, the log file. Again, we can see that there's an authentication mismatch. And we need to make them match. Configure router OSPF area 12 interface 2R2 authentication type will be message digest. Let me just clear the screen. And then I'll say message digest key 1 MD5. I wonder if there's a limit. So we can see here that the limit for the key is 16 characters, and on the password the limit is 8 characters. That's something that we have to remember. Router code should be fine. And the adjacency has come up again. The default is no authentication. Then I've showed you simple authentication. Now that was MD5 authentication. I'm going to remove the authentication and I'm going to show you the last and final way, which is the HMAC SHA authentication. So if I shut down the interface, say no authentication type, no message digest key 1. Bring the interface back up. Should have really done this in a notepad. I'll do the same on R2. Shut down the interface. Verify that they're up. Show router OSPF neighbor. Hasn't come up yet. Oh, because the interfaces are still shut down. So let me bring the interfaces up. I brought it up on this side. So show router OSPF neighbor. Still in two-way. taking its time. Now they've transitioned to full. If you actually wanted to see if authentication was enabled or not, we can have a look at show router interface detail and then just match on the authentication. So match auth. Maybe not. Show router interface 2R1 detail match lowercase maybe. Okay, let's get rid of the match auth. I'm pretty sure this was the command, and I know that there's authentication somewhere. No. Maybe I've put the wrong command in. Oh, maybe it's under OSPF. So router OSPF quit that slowly. Alright, I'll just type it all out. So first thing I'll do, exit all, show router OSPF interface 2R1 detail. Now I'll say match auth. Yes, here we go. So at the moment we've got no authentication. If we done MD5, it will say message digest, and if we done password, then it should say password. Actually, rather than me just saying that, let me configure one of them very quickly to prove my point. Configure router OSPF area 12 interface authentication type password. This should be enough. And now you can see that it says the authentication type is password. And if I change this to message digest, it's changed to MD5. I will clear the screen. I need to also remove this authentication. It's not shut down. Let me just see if I can remove it without closing down the interface. No authentication type message. Let's just say no authentication type info. Excellent. So there's actually no need to shut down the interface. So at the moment, both the neighbors are in the full state. As promised, I'm going to show you the fourth and final method. Now the fourth and final method is to actually configure a keychain. And to configure this, I will say configure system security. To do a keychain, it has to be under the security context. Keychain, just call it R2. This is the name of the keychain and it's only locally significant. Then I'm going to configure the direction, and this is going to be send and receive. You could either say unidirection, which is just sending or receiving, but I will say bi, which is sending and receiving. The keychain has to have a valid entry ID. A valid entry ID, a valid password, and a valid algorithm that OSPF can use. Entry 1, key, the password will be router coach. And I'll say the algorithm I'm going to use. You've got a few of them here. You've got HMAC SHA-1, HMAC SHA-256, HMAC MD5. We've already seen MD5, so I will use HMAC SHA-256. And I will do the begin time for this keychain. We'll say now. Now, if no date and time is set, then the key will not be valid. Back. Not back, I'll just say exit all. Then under OSPF, configure router OSPF area 12 for interface 2R1. I'll say auth keychain, we called it R2. And that is it. Now obviously that will bring the neighborship down. Show router OSPF neighbor. No neighbors because we've got SHA on this side and nothing on the other side. And if we wanted to actually see this keychain, we could say show security, show system security keychain R2 detail. It messed up again. And these are the parameters for the keychain. The algorithm that it's using is SHA. It's up. We're sending and receiving. And the begin time, well, the date is not correct, but that's when it's actually set to begin. This is it for the authentication states in OSPF. I hope you enjoyed the video. On to the next one.